welcome back to Rowing with the Homies. We have another walking edition today. I was getting ready to do the exercise, planning this episode out, and I just felt like I'd been sitting down for too long. I've been at the desk all day for work, so decided to hit the trail instead. So we're doing walking with the homies today, and thanks for joining me. As I was considering what to discuss today, I was reading through the news like I usually do at various times throughout the day, and I came across something that I found really interesting and kind of surprising, actually. I guess surprising because it's something that maybe I hadn't put much thought into as far as legal concerns go relating to the topic. But what's on my mind today is how England, the UK, is announcing a pretty big shift in its political landscape and how it functions as a democracy. They've decided to lower the voting age for general elections from 18 down to 16. And this is more than just a political adjustment. It is igniting, at least for me, but from what I understand, also just the broader societal conversation about youth, about responsibility, and what our foundational concepts about democracy even are. And it leads me to consider, when are individuals really prepared to vote, to have the maturity and the context and the understanding and the wherewithal and the will to safely exert that kind of power. I mean, this is, of course, if we're not operating from a position of cynicism, because democracies in the modern world are kind of, what's the right word for it? Problematic, questionable. It's doubtful if they actually function. You get what I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to approach this from, I guess, an optimistic, maybe philosophical perspective, to really get into the continuation of the last episode that I had about maturity. But I thought this was an interesting avenue of exploration. So let's dig in a little bit more to what's going on in the UK. And as I was saying, the Labour Party, which currently holds a strong majority in Parliament, made this a key commitment, and the legislation, the change, seems very likely to pass. And they have some compelling arguments. One of the main arguments is a variation of something that we're all familiar with, which is the no taxation without representation idea. This, of course, played out in our own revolution, but the general concept still holds true. If a 16-year-old can get a job, can earn money, can pay taxes, then it stands to reason that they should have a say in how those taxes that are collected are used. And I mean, that just makes sense. And beyond taxes, they also highlight existing rights in the UK, such as A 16-year-old with parental consent can join the military. A 16-year-old can work full-time, and they can consent to medical treatment. And if they are deemed mature enough for these pretty big life decisions and responsibilities, the question arises as to why the line would be drawn at the ballot box. And in a slightly broader context, this change would align the entire UK with what is already in practice in Scotland and Wales, where 16 and 17-year-olds can already vote in their local and regional elections. So there would be consistency there. Another significant argument revolves around fostering lifelong civic engagement. The idea there being that involving young people in voting at an earlier stage, especially while they are still in school and while they're at home, it might help them cultivate a habit of voting, a habit of engagement. Studies from places like Austria and Scotland, where the voting age has been lowered, actually suggest that these younger first-time voters tend to exhibit higher turnout rates than those who wait until they're 18. Again, that makes sense. They're in an environment where they're learning about the process in school, they can discuss it with their parents at home and with their peers, and then immediately apply that knowledge and practice at the ballot box. Of course, there's always criticisms. Some argue that 16-year-olds lack sufficient maturity, or that this is simply a partisan maneuver by the Labour Party intended to garner votes from a demographic that tends to lean more to the left or to the progressive side. The broader question, I think, is an interesting one. What is an appropriate age for this? And of course, I think it's interesting to compare the ideas with what is happening in the UK with what we do here in the US. Here, the voting age is 18, but it wasn't always 18. That was actually a result of the 26th Amendment in 1971, I think. Before that amendment was ratified, the national standard age was 21. And the push to lower the voting age in the US gained momentum during World War II, when the draft age was lowered to 18. And this sparked a powerful sentiment of, if you're old enough to fight, then you should be old enough to vote. And that same idea came up again during the Vietnam War, as many young men were being drafted and sent to combat. But many were denied the right to vote for the leaders making those life and death decisions. And it seemed, and it was fundamentally unequal, unfair. Initially, Congress did attempt to lower the voting age through legislation in 1970, but the Supreme Court later ruled that Congress lacked the authority to set the voting age for state and local elections. So, as I said it before, this ultimately led to the ratification of the 26th Amendment in 1971. So in the US at least, the path to the voting age being 18 was directly tied to wartime pressures and required that constitutional change. In the UK, though, the path to 18 being the voting age was somewhat different. Before 1969, the voting age was also 21. The decision to lower it to 18 was less about a single overwhelming public movement or a specific war, and more about a broader legislative effort to align the voting age with what society increasingly perceived as the new age of adulthood. It was part of a package of reforms that sought to streamline various age-related rights, such as the ability to enter into legal contracts, to hold property, or marry without parental consent. And they were all consolidated around that age of 18. It was a more holistic top-down approach to defining when a person was considered an adult in the eyes of the law. I find this historical difference in the process to be really interesting. The US change was largely a direct response to a military conscription during wartime, which then culminated in a constitutional change, whereas the UK's shift to 18 and now its current move to 16 being the legal voting age has been much more based in legislative processes. And they are driven by evolving societal norms around youth capabilities and a political party's commitment to expand the right to vote and ensure consistency across its constituent regions. And it's important to note that this discussion extends beyond the voting age itself. Different countries employ varying approaches to youth participation and democratic rights. Some maintain dedicated youth councils, others integrate civic education more deeply into their school systems, and there are nations with much more restrictive voting rights overall, where age might be just one of many barriers. Standard and normal are sometimes culturally dependent and can be subjective. It is an interesting feature of our colonial societies to have a very single, unified, air quote, normal idea or standard idea of what maturity looks like. As I'm considering this conversation and this law in the UK, it's hard to really quantify something as subjective as maturity by a number, because it's really about a much broader question of when is an individual fully ready to participate within their local community and then the broader national community. And that gets me thinking, as we're discussing whether a 16-year-old is prepared to cast a ballot, what about other boundaries that we establish regarding age and responsibility? These things present a fascinating and at times frustrating entanglement of laws, expectations, and cultural norms. Because it seems as if, given where we are, when we are, and who we're talking to, that we operate with various definitions, multiple definitions of what adulthood is and of what maturity is. Of course, I think my main point is that age and responsibility don't always align, and this can create some really interesting differences in how we define adulthood. For example, in the US, an individual can enlist in the military at 17 with parental consent, and at 18 without parental consent. Once enlisted, whether 17 or 18, you can be deployed to combat zones. You can be asked to make the rather jingoistic phrase, I guess, used here, the ultimate sacrifice. You can be expected to die for a country, but consider this contradiction. If you're 17, you can be fighting and dying in a war, but you can't buy alcohol or vote for the people who are sending you off to die. And that's a really interesting kind of paradox to be operating in. And of course, the United States is not alone with this. There are many countries that have military service functioning as a precedent for other adult privileges. But I don't think that changes the seemingly inconsistent expectation there of the risk of death. And then we can talk about employment and monetary and tax responsibilities. In the US, the minimum working age differs by state, but generally you can get a part-time job and start working, between the ages of 14 and 16, depending on where you live. In the UK, it's similar, with some work being allowed as early as 13 or 14. And in both of these places, as soon as your salary or your pay exceeds a certain threshold, you are then liable for income tax. A 16-year-old working a summer job is now contributing to the national revenue. But you can be a taxpayer contributing in that way, and yet again, not necessarily have a vote in how those dollars that you're contributing to the country, to the nation's budget, are spent. And it's a really messy contradiction where financial responsibility begins prior to full political representation and the ability to vote. And again, let's talk about drinking again. It seems like this is even more divergent depending on where you live. In the US, the legal age for drinking alcohol and purchasing alcohol is 21. Yet, you can travel to many European nations and find that the legal drinking age is 18 or even 16, depending on what type of alcohol is being served. And we can consider why there are so many differences between how we view these privileges and their relationship to age and maturity. And again, I think that there are differences in perception according to culture, and there are stigmas or accepted risks that are related to alcohol, because our country and many countries have a really interesting relationship with how it decides to permit or not permit substances. And alcohol and tobacco, to extend it a little bit, have been historically the United States accepted substances, where other countries, because of cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, whatever, restrict or allow different substances at different ages. So again, messy, complicated. There are other adult privileges to consider, like lottery tickets, like entering into marriage without parental consent, like signing legally binding contracts, or getting a license to drive a car. The age at which these things are permitted varies not only by country, but sometimes even within regions of the same country. Again, I'll ask the question, why is the age for consuming alcohol or gambling higher than the age for military service or paying taxes in some places? This highlights that our definitions of responsibility and risk are not universally applied or even consistently weighted. And while legal ages provide a framework, the very concept of maturity and responsibility are shaped by deeper cultural currents. Across different societies, there are often universal understandings of what it means to be mature. Things like developing self-sufficiency, the ability to contribute to your community, understanding the consequences of your actions, and demonstrating emotional regulation. These are qualities that most cultures value in a person who is grown up. But where these ideas come from and how they are expressed can vary dramatically. For example, some cultures might emphasize responsibility stemming from religious traditions, where certain rites of passage or adherence to moral codes define maturity. Philosophical schools of thought, like the emphasis on individual autonomy in some Western societies versus collective harmony in others, can also play a significant role. Economic structures can dictate when a person is expected to become financially independent, and historical experiences, such as periods of conflict or scarcity, might accelerate or delay the perceived onset of adulthood. Family structures can also be powerful influences, with some cultures emphasizing extended family interdependence over individual independence. So, while the underlying ideas of maturity may be universal, how they manifest and when they are expected to be fully realized can differ. And this leads to the wide variety and variance of expectations that is observed. In some cultures, there's a much stronger emphasis on family responsibilities and contributions from a younger age. The concept of leaving the nest or achieving financial independence also differs greatly in some places. And then there's the contemporary phenomenon of adulting. It's a term that has almost become a meme, reflecting a perceived delay in traditional markers of adulthood, such as purchasing a home or getting married or having children. Even as formal responsibilities like taxes or student loan payments commence earlier than ever, it seems that we are expected to be responsible adults on paper, but the path to truly feeling like one, or possessing the traditional markers of one, appears to be growing longer and more complex. But it's clear that the lines we draw around age and responsibility are arbitrary and often contradictory. One moment an individual is deemed mature enough to serve their country, the next day they are considered too young to purchase alcohol. This constant renegotiation of what is expected of us and what we are permitted to do can be a heavy burden. And sometimes that weight can feel like something much deeper. And that brings me to the last segment, and today depression feels like. And to continue the theme, today depression feels like the weight of expectations. It's a feeling of when the things that we want to pursue to give our lives meaning, like caring for others, like upholding our responsibilities, like maintaining our own well-being, can suddenly transform into something that feels nearly unbearable. And of course, this can show up a lot of different ways. Caring is, or at least it should be, I think, an integral part of our lives. That emotional labor of nurturing our relationships to our friends, to our families, to our partners should be invigorating, should be sustaining. And it is when we're feeling well. It could be a source of joy, a source of connection. But when we have those feelings of depression, that care can shift and instead start feeling more like an obligation. All of those text messages, all of the phone calls, all of the little ways that others seek for us to support them, and the ways in which we really do want to be supportive, they can feel like impossible tasks, constantly giving of ourselves, and that extends to our professional responsibilities as well. The pressure to perform, to meet deadlines, to be on, to be pushed to climb. All of those things can yield a sense of weight, of being borne down upon. There's the unwritten rules of how society might view us as being a good person, being available, being positive, always contributing. When we're battling depression, these usually simple expectations can feel like damn near impossible things to reach. And then we feel guilty. And even self-care, which is intended to be beneficial, can instead start to feel like a chore. Whether we're engaging in a walk, or preparing a meal, or pursuing a hobby, they instead can start to feel like items on a checklist. And when depression is present, these things that we set out to do well, to do good, can feel repetitive, futile, and somehow impossible. And as we experience these pressures, our internal monologue often shifts from you can do this to why is this so difficult for me? Why does everybody else seem to be having such an easier time? We isolate ourselves. We allow the feelings of guilt to stack, and it all just becomes overwhelming. This feeling of being overwhelmed by the patterns of our lives is a common experience, especially when we are living with depression. It is certainly not a sign of weakness. In fact, recognizing it, acknowledging it, and discussing it is a profound act of strength. Just remember, you're not alone. We're in this together. And sometimes just knowing that can make the burden feel a little lighter. So if you're listening and any of this resonates with your experience, please understand that you are absolutely not alone. When the weight feels too much, I encourage you to remember it's okay to take a break, to seek help, or to simply acknowledge the immense effort it takes to just keep going. If you find yourself struggling with the weight of expectations or feelings of depression, please reach out to a trusted friend, a family member, or a mental health professional. Resources are available. You don't have to carry this weight alone. That concludes this episode of Rowing with the Homies. I hope our conversation today provided you with some food for thought and perhaps a sense of connection. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for the show, you can send them by email, finlos@finloslives.com. You can visit the website, finloslives.com, or you can reach out to me on social media. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next conversation.